Mandatory minimum laws are barbaric and should be removed from the criminal justice system. First created in 1986, mandatory minimum laws have been sending people to prison for nonviolent crimes since their inception. They disproportionately affect minority communities, and they strip judges of all personal discretion. Mandatory minimums began with the War on Drugs, which was a government program started under the Nixon administration to reduce drug use in America. They did this by implementing harsh drug laws and introducing mandatory minimum sentences for crimes such as possession. One of Nixon's top advisors, Josh Ehrlichman, later admitted that the War on Drugs was started to disrupt the hippie movement and African American communities. Ehrlichman states, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." Based on what he said, you can see that the War on Drugs was started solely to affect black communities and to disrupt the anti-war movement. The racial inequality when discussing mandatory minimums is still in effect today. Mandatory minimum laws send minorities to prison at higher rates than their white counterparts. So, according to the Sentencing Project, an advocacy group looking to reform the criminal justice system, federal prosecutors, for example, are twice as likely to charge African Americans with offenses that carry mandatory minimum sentences compared to similarly situated white people. African Americans are far more likely to be charged with mandatory minimum sentences, thus disproportionately increasing the black prison population. Along with this, according to the civil rights lawyer Michelle Alexander, the mandatory minimum laws became the new Jim Crow laws. This comparison rings true as they were originally created to oppress black people and are still in use today. This disproportionate incarceration of black Americans has decimated their communities. According to the Sentencing Project, families are ripped apart for nonviolent crimes because of mandatory minimums created by federal and state government. So there is a racial inequality when looking at mandatory minimum laws in the United States, and this must be changed. Along with racial inequality, mandatory minimums should be abolished because they have been increasing the prison population since the 70s. Renika Guion, a researcher on matters pertaining to law, states, "It is not the crime rate that has caused this increase, but changes and implementation of laws such as mandatory minimum. From 1970 to present day, prisons went from 200,000 inmates to almost 2 million inmates." And as you can see from this chart right here, the prison population has skyrocketed since the start of the War on Drugs. So with mandatory minimum laws in place, the prison population skyrockets, and judges are unable to make judgment calls on a case-by-case basis. They are unable to take into consideration the context surrounding a crime, and they are forced to make a blanket judgment on all cases of the same crime. Judge Cohn, a judge appointed by Jimmy Carter, discussed this issue. He said, "The most sacred quality that judges guard most is discretion, which is choice," he said. "Mandatory minimums take that choice away from a judge, and you're obliged to follow that certain statute." Another federal judge, Mark Bennett, an outspoken opponent of mandatory minimum laws, agrees with Cohn and also elaborates on the harshness of mandatory minimum laws. He states, "These mandatory minimum laws are so incredibly harsh, and they're triggered by such low level of drugs that they snare at these nonviolent, low-level addicts who are involved in drug distribution, mostly just to obtain drugs to feed their habit." So mandatory minimum sentences are harsh, even according to judges that are handing these sentences out. Along with this, they strip the judge of considering the context of the crime. There are many people still clinging to the war on drugs era legislation and unwilling to let these laws die in the past. The main argument against abolishing mandatory minimum laws is that the people receiving these unfair sentences are criminals and deserve to be put in prison. The criminal justice system should not focus on punishment, but instead rehabilitation. And even though they committed a crime, it does not mean that they should be put in prison for a significant part of their life. People tend to dehumanize prisoners for the sole reason that they made a mistake, and this is wrong. Everyone in prison is human and deserves a fair punishment. Another common argument is that mandatory minimum laws remove violent offenders from the general population and thus keep the public safe. The problem with this is that most of the people sent to prison with mandatory minimum sentences are there for non-violent crimes and drug offenses. These arguments are based on the fact that a person becomes subhuman when they commit a crime and should be treated less than human by the criminal justice system. So there are many things you can do to help abolish mandatory minimum sentences, and the main thing that a person can do is vote, and vote in lawmakers who support abolishing mandatory minimum sentencing. So mandatory minimum laws have been decimating minority communities, significantly increased the U.S. prison population, and they strip judges of personal discretion when deciding cases. These laws are outdated and have ultimately been proven to be ineffective and should be abolished. Along with mandatory minimums, the entire criminal justice system should be looked over with a close eye in order to remove any outdated laws and bias.